So, Clerk, could you do a roll call vote, please? Thank you.
Chairwoman Macbeth.
Present.
Co-Vice Chair Slater. Co-Vice Chair Chippendale. Secretary Johnston.
Here.
Representative Carson.
Here.
Representative Corvese. Here. Representative Edwards. Representative Handy.
Here.
Representative McKiernan.
Present.
Representative O'Brien.
Here.
Representative Palangio. Here. Representative Riley.
Present.
Representative Serpa. Representative Winfield. Here. Madam Chair, we do have a quorum.
Thank you. Tonight's House Committee on Oversight is meeting, and on the agenda we have our General Treasurer, Treasurer Magaziner, here to present to us on the evolution of tax credits programs in the state of Rhode Island. And then after that, we have Chief Dion here from the Office of Revenue for an analysis of the Department of Revenue's overview on the costs and the benefit analysis of tax credit programs. General Treasurer, are you ready? So we do have a PowerPoint that he has prepared for us that it will be up on the screen, but we also have a copy here. What we'll do is we'll have him go through, probably as we have done in the past, we'll go through a couple pages, and then if you have questions, we'll ask them before we go on.
We're just waiting for the computer here. Oh, here we go.
Well, you work on that. Since we have paper copies, you can work from there?
Started? Yeah.
Yeah, and then we can
Absolutely.
work on that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come. I, in some ways, am an unlikely person, I guess, to be presenting at a committee investigating 38 Studios, since I've only been in office for a year and was not around when all of that was taking place. But this is now my second oversight hearing. I did one in the Senate side about a month ago. And while I can't speak to how the 38 Studios deal came about and who said what to who and so on, what I can do is present some ideas for what the state should do going forward to help us avoid some of these pitfalls in the future and to do things better going forward. So that's what I hope to do today. I'm going to be focusing on the subject of tax credits. Now, as you all may recall, there was a tax credit deal that was in the works, so to speak, to support 38 Studios. It was not actually completed. The credit was never actually awarded. But a number of questions have come to light in regards to that tax credit transaction, and I think it's led to a number of questions from the public and others about, for example, who are all these people who were involved? Why were they involved? Why do you need to have a broker of a tax credit? Why do you need to have private investors? Is that necessary? Is it really the best use of the public's money? Do you need to have brokers and investors and these other third parties in order for a tax credit program to work? And our conclusion in Treasury, after studying this for the last month or so, is no, you don't need to have brokers or private investors for a tax credit program to work. And in fact, that may not be the best type of tax credit program, one where you have all of these other third parties getting a public benefit. There may be, and we feel that there are, much more efficient ways to operate a tax credit program where you can still have the same benefits supporting economic development, construction, jobs, film productions, etc., but to do it more cheaply, more cost effectively, and eliminating some of these middlemen and some of these third parties, some of whom have gotten some attention from this committee and others looking into the 38 Studios situation. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. How do you take a tax credit program and make it as efficient and cost effective as possible? Just for a summary, Rhode Island currently has 4 tradable tax credit programs. the Historic Tax Credit, which promotes the rehabilitation of historic buildings. This is our oldest tax credit program. We've had it in one form or another since 2001. It's awarded by the Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission, administered by the Division of Taxation. The second oldest is the Film Production Tax Credit, which has existed in its current form since 2005 and promotes not only films but also other artistic productions, television productions, theater, etc. This one's administered by the Rhode Island Film and TV Office, and this was the one that was potentially at play in 38 studios. And then there are two new tax credit programs, tradable tax credit programs, that were enacted by the General Assembly last year in 2015. One of them is the Rebuild Rhode Island Tax Credit. This is designed to promote construction projects of special economic significance to the state, not just historic structures, though it can be historic structures, but really any type of construction project with significant economic importance. No credits have been awarded yet through this program, but it is being administered by the Rhode Island Commerce Corporation, who expects to start issuing credits under this program soon. And then the other new one that was enacted last year is the Qualified Job Incentives Tax Credit. The idea here is to encourage companies to hire here in Rhode Island who would otherwise be hiring in other states. The first credit, as you may have read, was just awarded this week by Commerce Rhode Island to a company in Lincoln called Greystone. I'll go a little bit more in depth into these later in the presentation. What is a tax credit program? Why would you have one? Tax credits allow governments to fund and promote projects of public policy importance. But the key point to understand here is that under a tax credit program, the state has no cost, has no financial liability unless the project has been successfully completed. So in some ways, it would be much simpler if you gave a developer or a film producer a bunch of money up front to facilitate their production. But then you run the risk of the project failing. You run the risk of, the developer skipping town with the money. With a tax credit, the state is not actually on the hook until after the project is complete. That's why the 38 Studios tax credit deal never reached completion, because the project was ultimately not successful. The federal government has been providing tradable tax credits for about a generation now. The largest program, I believe, is for historic rehabilitation, and dozens of other states also offer tradable tax credits. The way it works in its simplest form is represented in the chart at the bottom of the slide, where the state awards a tax credit to a developer, whether it's a building developer or a film producer or the like. After the project is completed, the developer then can deduct the value of the credit from their tax liability. This is the simplest way that a tax credit program can work, and it does often work in exactly this way. But it can be much more complicated than this. For example, what happens if the developer needs cash up front to facilitate the project? Under this model, if the developer needs money before the project to actually fund the building expenses or the film expenses, this alone doesn't help them. So this is where the lender gets involved. After the developer is awarded a tax credit, the developer can go to a lender, whether it's a bank or any other lender, take out a loan, use the loan proceeds to complete the project. After the project is completed, the developer takes the benefit of the credit out of their taxes and then pays the lender back. Sometimes it works this way, but again, oftentimes it's actually more complicated. Because what happens if the developer, after the project is complete, still doesn't have enough income to pay the lender back? What if the developer doesn't have enough taxable income to claim the full value of the tax credit? This is where the private investors and sometimes the brokers get involved. Now, this is a very complicated chart, but this is often the way that tax credit programs work. And so I'll walk you through it step by step.
Before you do, can I just ask if there's any questions?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
So under this scenario, and this is a very common one, and this is the one that I think most closely mirrors what was planned with the 38 Studios deal. The state awards the tax credit to the developer. The developer then connects with private investors that pay a lot of taxes, either directly or through a broker, and there's an agreement made that the developer will sell the tax credit to the broker and to these private investors. But the key point here is the sale doesn't actually happen yet. It's just an agreement to make the sale to the broker and the investors after the project is complete. It's an agreement to make a sale. It's not actually a sale yet. So the developer agrees to sell the tax credit to the broker and the private investors, then goes and takes out the bank loan to fund the project. Project is funded, the project is completed. After the project is completed, the sale occurs. The developer sells the tax credit to the private investors, possibly through a broker, uses the cash proceeds from that sale to pay back the lender. And then the private investors who have purchased the tax credit use that credit to offset their tax liability. Another point to note here is that oftentimes the sale of the tax credit to an investor is a taxable event at the federal level. So the broker may have to pay federal income taxes on the proceeds from the sale of the tax credit. Now, there can be ways to get around this. There are examples of complex transactions that have been successfully performed that allow the developer to avoid the federal tax liability, but more often than not, there is that tax liability. So,
before you go on to just slide 6, and we had a discussion looking at, because we're looking at 38 Studios, and then looking at this wonderful chart that you've put together. That isn't the sequence that happened with the tax credits with 38 Studios. In fact, the state had not awarded them. And the important thing in this is the SCC is investigating this. And basically what we've been able to show is they had brokers, they went to lenders, but we hadn't assigned the tax credits yet. So they just assumed they were going to get it and bypassed that and went on to the other steps that you've talked about. So, thank you.
So there's pros and cons to this model. On the positive, again, there's no expense to the state unless the project is completed. That's a pro. The developer gets the cash that they need up front to help fund their project, their building or their film or what have you. And the developer can use the proceeds of the tax credit sale to repay the lender. So it doesn't matter if the developer doesn't owe a lot of taxes after the project is complete. The developer is still able to use the sale of the tax credit to somebody who does owe a lot of taxes, use those proceeds to pay back the lender. On the downside, there's a whole lot of players involved here, and everyone's getting paid in one way or another. So it's not necessarily, under this model, the most efficient way to fund a project. It's also worth noting that, okay, of these different parties that are involved, the lender is taking on some risk. If the project fails, then the lender who made the loan to the developer will lose their investment, so they're getting compensated for risk. The brokers and the private investors, because they're not actually purchasing the tax credit until after the project is complete, they're not necessarily taking on a whole lot of risk. They're being compensated despite taking on much risk in this scenario. And that can be the sign of an inefficient market. It's one thing if people are getting paid for taking on risk, but if they're getting paid for a riskless or close to riskless investment, that's the sign that the market may not be operating as efficiently, the system may not be operating as efficiently as it could be. And just to illustrate, and I will emphasize that this is these numbers are not exact and they're not universal, but this is a representative example of where the benefit of a tax credit program may go. And this is based on our offices over the last few weeks had a number of conversations with developers, attorneys, others who have been involved on the tax credit scene in Rhode Island for a number of years to give us a rough idea of how these deals generally go. And under this scenario, you can assume that the broker and the investors are buying the credit for around 85 cents on the dollar. That tends to be, at least for the historic tax credit, the numbers that we've been hearing recently. The lender, let's say, is getting about 5% of the benefit. They're getting paid for the risk that they're taking on for their loan. If the tax credit is being sold to a broker or an investor, it can be a federally taxable event for the developer. And what this means under this scenario, and again, this is just a representative example, only about 55% of the dollar that the state is spending on the tax credit program is actually going to the project that you're trying to help, is actually going to that building or to that film. In other words, in plain English, under this scenario, to support a $5.5 million project, the cost of the state would be about $10 million. Just a representative example to kind of paint a picture of what this can look like without any controls in place. Let me just give another caveat, too, which is say there was no sale, say that the developer had the income to just use the credit against their own taxes, then this would look very different. Then there would be no investors, no broker, and also no federal tax liability if the developer was able to just use the credit themselves without having to trade it. So this is just a representative example of what it would look like in a situation where the developer did have to sell the credit to a private investor.
Before you go on to the next slide, though, Vice Chair Chippendale has a question.
Mr. Treasurer, thank you very much for providing us with simple and easy to understand stuff, because guys like me need all the pictures we can get on this. So I'm looking at the percentages here, and it's representative as a linear breakdown with the total net proceeds being about 55%, as you indicated. Are every one of those percentages, are they all, is it all cumulative, or is a broker, say, making 5% of the entirety or 5% of the net proceeds? Is it ever mixed up that way?
Yeah, I'll just say these deals are by no means standard,
Sure.
So they can happen in all kinds of different ways, and the actual price that a broker or a private investor would charge can be calculated in all kinds of different ways. It's negotiated, okay. And it may be a percent of the project expenses. It may be a percent of the full credit. I mean, there's no standard way of doing it. And actually, you raise an important point, which I was going to get to later, which is that up until now, there's been no public reporting of the prices or the terms of tax credit transactions, which is one of the recommendations that I'm going to be making at the end, that there should be some more transparency around that.
Okay, thank you very much.
So what I just showed you is an example of how a tax credit program might look if there were no controls in place to make it efficient. There are ways to make tax credit programs more efficient so that the state gets more bang for its buck, so that that $5.5 million of actual project costs could cost the state less than $10 million to support. There are ways of making tax credit programs more efficient, and some of these methods have already been adopted in one form or another in some of the state's programs. So there's a few different ways that you can, in layman's terms, make the system cheaper for the taxpayer by eliminating some of the need for these middlemen or these third parties. One way is to make tax credits refundable, which I'll explain in a minute. And that's already been adopted in some of Rhode Island's tax credit programs. Another way that I've been asked about a lot is, well, instead of having a private person out there who's acting as the broker between the buyer and the seller of the tax credits, could the state just create some sort of a website or an exchange to connect the buyers and sellers? You could do that. Or a perhaps less efficient but still viable version would be to keep the same system, the original system, but through better reporting and better transparency, try to make the market for tax credits a little more efficient. So let me walk through each of these three options. It's sort of a menu of options that you could choose from, some of which have already been adopted. So option one, making tax credits refundable. What this basically entails is saying that if the developer needs to sell a tax credit because the developer doesn't have enough of a tax liability to claim it against their own taxes, well, instead of selling it to a broker or a private investor, sell it back to the state. Under this model, just following the chart, state awards the credit to the developer. The developer takes out the loan, completes the project. Then the developer sells the credit back to the state for cash. It's kind of like instead of awarding a tax credit, you could be awarding, a grant, but only after the project has been completed. Then the developer takes the proceeds from that and uses the proceeds from that sale to the state to repay the lender. The benefit here is that there is no need for private investors or brokers. The state doesn't need to be, charging any more for this than the most efficient price. The developer doesn't matter whether they have a large tax liability at the end of the project or not. They're still able to get the benefit of a sale. And there are some downsides, though. The state would be paying in cash rather than paying through tax forgiveness. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's more expensive. In fact, I think that in most cases it would be cheaper for the state to do, but it does create some additional challenges for budgeting, and so would maybe, produce some extra gray hairs from the folks in the budget office or the fiscal office who have to plan for these things. And also, there is, in kind of a roundabout way, having tradable tax credits and looking at what the purchase and sale prices for those credits are can give you some interesting data to look at to see, is the state issuing larger credits than it needs to? If, the state's issuing a credit at $1 million and then it's being sold to a private broker at, 40 cents on the dollar, that could be a sign that maybe the state was awarding a larger credit than it needed to. So there is some interesting data that could be found by keeping the system tradable, but it's not necessarily the most cost-effective way. So under this example, a refund example, it would look more like this. You still have the lender. There's still a project financing loan that's taking place. It would still be a federally taxable event when the developer sold the credit back to the state, but that's it. And under this model, if you, again, simplifying, but if you assume, the cut of the bank is still the same and the cut of the federal tax liability is still the same, far more of the benefit is going to the actual project, which would mean that you would not need such a large tax credit to support a project of a given size. That same $5.5 million of project expenses that cost $10 million in the last example would potentially only cost the state less than $8 million under this example, because you're essentially eliminating these parties that are being compensated without the refundability. Taking it a step further, there's a line of thought that says, okay, you allow the developer the option of selling the credit back to the state. Maybe the state could save even more money by buying back the credit for less than 100 cents on the dollar. Maybe if the state bought it back at 99 or 98 or 95 cents on the dollar, then you could make it even more efficient because the state would be spending less than they would if they bought it back at 100 cents on the dollar. That is true, but it's true only if there isn't a private broker or investor who's willing to come in and pay more. So if you had a refundable tax credit that could be refunded to the state at 90 cents on the dollar, that would save the state another 10% on the value of the credit. But if somebody else was willing to come in and buy it at 91 cents on the dollar, then the state wouldn't save anything extra. So you're kind of, you're taking a risk there, a risk of maybe trying to be a little too cute if you have that floor being too low. But certainly it is possible that by refunding at less than 100 cents on the dollar, you could save the state some additional money. Option 2, and this is the one that I get asked about the most. Rather than having this private broker who's getting paid to connect a developer with an investor, why not just have the state be the broker? Why not have the state set up a website or some kind of exchange with a list of all the people who are selling tax credits, a list of all those who are buying, to connect the buyers and the sellers? The pros of this model are that it eliminates the need for a private broker. And, it also may reduce the margin that the private investors would be paying too, because by having a more transparent market of who the buyers and sellers are, the developer would have a little more leverage to get the best deal available and maybe sell that credit for 98 cents on the dollar instead of 93. The cons are, because that private investor is still involved, it's still not as efficient a system as option one. It's still not, in theory, going to save you as much as just going the refund route. But it is better, certainly, than doing nothing. And, of course, as we all in government know, operating a website can sometimes be a little more complicated than it looks. And while it's certainly viable, there would be some cost and some challenge to operating that sort of an exchange effectively. So, again, just a representative example of what this might look like. Under this scenario, there is no private broker. The exchange, the state-run exchange, could maybe charge a small fee to cover our operating expenses, but it wouldn't need to be as large as what the private brokers tend to make. The investors in this example, and again, this is all speculative, but the investors would maybe be getting a 5% cut instead of 10% because it's a more efficient market with more transparency. You would still have the bank loan. The sale to the private investors could still be a federally taxable event. But under this model, that $5.5 million project that you're trying to support would cost less than the $10 million in the absence of an online exchange.
Before you go on, we have a question. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Treasurer. As you've so clearly illustrated, and in my line of work, it's the same thing. The more hands touch something, the more people are being paid, and that certainly takes away from what ultimately the people we want to get these resources will get. With this model here, which I can see where the net is a little bit less. Are we, as a state, is your office able to say, okay, we've got this pool that we can define of what we're going to make available as credits in whatever form they happen to take, and then with that fixed cost, which we should presumably be able to at least get a ballpark of plus or minus 10% relative to the website, the administration thereof, staffing, or anything like that. And then amortize that across all of the credits. Would we be able to, with a relative degree of certainty, say, okay, here are our fixed costs, and then administer the program that way, and it sort of eliminating another hand that it goes through, therefore eliminating another chunk. I get that it's not as efficient as the refund, but would that? It
would be an improvement still, yeah. And, I think that we could certainly try to estimate what the cost of operating a system like this would be. I think the variable is how much in tradable credits are out there. We know how much are out there today. We don't know how much will be awarded in the future, and so that's a big variable.
That would be a moving target every year?
Yeah, to some extent. I'm going to get to this later in the presentation. There are some controls in place.
Sorry for jumping ahead
with
the question.
There are some controls in place for some of the programs around how much can be issued, but that would be the variable. I'll also say another aspect to the online exchange idea is, I asked the question to my team when we were preparing this, why hasn't the private sector stepped in and offered this solution already? You would think there's an opportunity to be had here, and it does turn out we found one company out of California that's in the process of trying to launch a website to facilitate the exchange of tradable tax credits. They're kind of a startup. They're new. I don't know how much of a track record they have, but we have been in contact with them, and I imagine if we did go down this route, we or the state would put out an RFP and solicit bids and so on.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
Maybe I should have started with this because I know I had some misunderstanding. Maybe we could go in, before you continue, just a little bit of background of what your office, where it...
Yeah. The Treasury has historically not had any involvement in tax credit programs. As I laid out at the beginning, some of the programs have been administered by the Commerce Department or the old EDC, some by other offices. The Division of Taxation is ultimately tasked with tracking who are the holders of tax credits, and then, of course, making sure that when they are redeemed that those folks are paid. Treasury has not had any involvement in the past. We were asked to come and present on this topic and are happy to do so. And I think that we are well suited to do so because we are a financial office, even though we haven't dealt with tax credits in the past. And I think we're able to offer some impartial opinions because, we don't have skin in the game one way or another. We're able to be, I think, impartial and balanced in both our analysis and in the recommendations that I'm going to offer shortly.
Thank you. I think we have another question. Yes, Representative.
Yes, thank you. I'm finding all of this very interesting, but did 38 Studios or that 38 Studios mess, for lack of better words, take advantage of any tax credits? Not that I'm aware of.
No, they were trying, but it's looking at the whole procedures of the tax credits and what we can put into place, because we do have lenders in the state that did lend money and did take a loss.
So this isn't directly involved with the 38 Studios per se?
Some of it is looking at the history of it and what they were trying to do, and then tax credits in general and where we can move to make sure that we don't have that happen again, where they're believing they're getting tax credits and they're going to our lenders. And
I think it's accurate to say that although the tax credit deal in 38 Studios was not completed, it did bring the issue to light and the topic to light that maybe our tax credit programs can be run more effectively. There are certain, high-profile parties and individuals who stood to make a lot of money if the tax credit deal had gone through. And I think, it's legitimate and important for us to be asking, is that really necessary? And I'm arguing that it's not.
I guess the other question I had was, what criteria must someone meet to become a broker?
I'm not sure that there is any. I don't think that it's a regulated profession. I could be wrong about that, and Paul might know better than I do, but I don't believe there is a license or anything like that.
So anyone could call themselves a broker and, according to some of these figures, could make obviously hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more.
Yeah, someone else might correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any requirements to be a broker.
Was 38 Studios far enough along in the game of receiving tax credits or vying for tax credits where they had a broker involved in the situation? And if so, who was that?
I only know what I've read in the media and in the depositions, but my understanding is that there was an individual who was attempting to be a broker or who was acting as a broker, representing himself as a broker. That would be Mr. Corso.
Mr. Corso.
This was before my time, so I only know what I've read in the
Mine
media.
as well.
Yeah.
we can get you the documentation on that, of what he was doing and how much.
I kind of assumed that that's who it was, but.
Yeah.
Thank you. If you want to continue, thank you.
All right, thank you. So the third option that I'll present, if you didn't want to go the refundability route and you didn't want to go the online exchange route, you could stick with just the traditional model that I laid out at the beginning, but require that every time a tax credit sale or transaction was made, that the price of the transfer be reported, say, to the Division of Taxation and be posted online. And this would at least lead to a more efficient market where developers would have a better idea what a fair price to settle for their credit would be. And I don't want to belabor this one too much, but again, under this version, all the players from the original version are still there, but maybe the broker and the investors are making a little less because the developer has more information about what a fair price for his or her credit would be. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these controls, some of these options for reform have already been implemented to some extent in our existing tax credit programs, and I do think it's important to run through those briefly. With the original historic tax credit, this was established in 2001. When it was originally established, these controls were not in place. There was also no limit on the amount of tax credits invested, and there wasn't any test to make sure that those who were receiving the historic tax credits, developers, building owners, actually needed them. Originally, anybody who was doing an eligible project to their building would get a credit. regardless of whether they needed it or not. Then after a while, I think we moved to a raffle-based system. But there wasn't a needs test. Because there wasn't any limit or test on it, there was a huge number of historic tax credits issued in the early 2000s. At one point, I believe there were more than $300 million of historic tax credits floating around waiting to be used or claimed. At that point, the General Assembly chose to freeze the program in 2008, still honor the credits that had already been issued, but not issue any new ones. There was, I gather, some anxiety that with more than $300 million of credits outstanding, it would be a real hit to the state if a large percentage of those were all claimed in 1 year. And so the decision was made back then to issue a bond to help smooth out the costs of the credits that had been issued under this program and provide some budget flexibility. It, of course, succeeded in providing that budget flexibility, but predictability. But the downside is that's another layer of cost, paying the debt service on the bond. In 2013, the historic tax credit program was changed again, and the credits were made 100% refundable to nonprofits that were holders of the tax credit. So a nonprofit developer, for example, an AS220 or a school that was awarded a historic tax credit could sell it back to the state for 100 cents on the dollar. And a private developer who was a holder of a tax credit could sell it to a nonprofit at, say, 97, 98 cents, and then the nonprofit would then go and redeem it for 100. And that is now becoming fairly common. We estimate, and Paul knows these numbers better than I do, that about $140 million of those old historic tax credits approved before 2008 are still outstanding today. The film production tax credit, there's a cap on how much can be issued each year. Up until this year, the cap has been $15 million annually, with $5 million per project. The film production tax credit is not refundable, although it is generally more efficient than the historic tax credit program. And when I say efficient, I mean more cost-effective with less leakage to third parties. The reason is that while it may take a year or two to restore a large building, your average movie or play is only in production for a few months, so the cost of the loan is much cheaper, and also the amount of time that goes by elapses before the sale. So what we hear anecdotally, and it's all anecdote because there is no standardized reporting of these things, is that generally the film tax credits, when they are sold, sell for around 90 cents on the dollar, as opposed to the historic tax credits, which are trading before the 100% refundability, we're trading at 80, 85 cents. So the film tax credit is more efficient because of the shorter time frame that's involved. The two new tax credit programs that were approved last year, Rebuild Rhode Island and the Qualified Job Incentives, have a number of new controls that are new to Rhode Island that will stand to make these programs more efficient. Perhaps the most important one is that unlike the old historic tax credit program back in the early 2000s, there is a needs test for both Rebuild and for the Qualified Jobs Incentive tax credit. So if you are a developer who wants to rehab or build a structure and use the Rebuild Rhode Island tax credit, you have to demonstrate to the Commerce Department that your project would not be economically feasible unless you received the credit. This is new, and this is, I think, a very important development. You have to share your financials, your pro formas, etc., to the Commerce Department, demonstrate that you actually need the tax credit in order for your project to occur. There's a cap of $15 million per project, and there is a refundability of the Rebuild Rhode Island tax credit, although the refund is at 90 cents on the dollar, which, again, makes for a more efficient system. It may set sort of a floor on the price of tax credits, and it could save the state some extra money, but only if somebody else isn't willing to come along and buy it for 91%. Another important new feature, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is that for Rebuild and also for the new jobs tax credit, the tax credit can't be claimed all in 1 year. It has to be claimed gradually over 5 years. So I'm a developer. I finish my project. I'm ready to either redeem my tax credit for 90 cents on the dollar or apply it against my tax liability. I can't do it all in 1 year. I have to do it over a 5-year period. And I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of that in a second, because I actually think this is an important point. Yes?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So with the criteria that need to be established, as you pointed out, in order to establish that, it's obligatory to have these, otherwise the project cannot proceed. Using the old, making your resume fit every particular job and making it different, as an example, would these pro formas, would these business plans and these other documents that are part of the application process, would these be existing documents that they've already submitted, whether it was to Commerce or to anyone else? Would they be existing, tax documents, or would there be a separate process where they might be able to enhance it, and if you don't understand where I'm going, to try to make it more favorable towards them getting the credits, or are we dealing with strictly, hey, these are the documents?
Yeah. So you'll have to ask the Commerce Office what their rules, regulations, procedures will be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things that we had talked about together is even if they met all of the criteria and submitted everything, it's still up to the Commerce Corporation to decide whether they get it or not. And that's something that we will be following up with, because that certainly then lends itself to who will get it and who won't.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the policy objective is to only award it to those that actually would need it, and to award it to those projects that would have the greatest economic impact for the state. But the exact ins and outs of how that's determined is something that the Commerce Office would be more well-suited to answer than me. The Qualified Job Incentive Tax Credit has all those same new controls as rebuild. The employer has to demonstrate that it would be cheaper for them to hire somebody in a different state unless they receive the tax credit. So again, there's that needs test that exists in rebuild. That same 90% refundability is there in the Qualified Jobs Incentive Tax Credit. Although I think it's also worth noting here that because these are by and large going to be awarded to employers of some size in Rhode Island, it's more likely that they are going to be tax-paying employers that are just going to use the tax credit to offset their own taxes and not try to trade it or refund it. That's, may not be the outcome in every case, but it's much more likely to be the outcome here than for a building development or a film. And then there's also that same 5-year smooth requirement as in Rebuild Rhode Island. And this is my final slide before I get to the recommendations. I do think it's worth thinking about this 5-year amortization, or this 5-year smooth requirement that's new to both Rebuild Rhode Island and the Qualified Jobs Credit, because there are pros and cons to it. On the pro side, certainly it provides more budget flexibility. You're not going to run the risk of being hit by a full redemption or a full claim against a tax liability all in 1 year. It also could give you the opportunity to put some more accountability into place. So now, not only are you making sure that the project is complete, but you could make sure that the building is still full, or that the employee is still employed up to 5 years after the credit is awarded. So it gives the opportunity for that greater accountability as well. But there is a downside, and the downside is that by stretching out the length of time during which the benefit of the credit can be claimed, you are stretching out the length of the loan that was used to finance the project and leading to higher expense. We have no way of knowing right now how much greater this expense to the lender will be, this expense to the servicing the bridge loan. But, as a representative example, it is at least conceivably possible that adding another 5 years onto the loan will make the loan so expensive that the credit becomes inefficient again and less efficient than it would have been without any controls in place. So again, just a representative example, because there haven't been any Rebuild Rhode Island credits issued yet with this provision, it's really hard to know exactly what the extra cost of the loan will be, but it's very likely that there will be at least some extra cost to the loan because of the longer duration. So given that, we at Treasury have 3 recommendations. Our recommendations are geared around making tax credits as efficient as possible. What is the cheapest way for the state to support a project of a given expense? Our recommendation is that we move to 100% refundability of all tax credits, not just the historic. We feel that this is the most efficient way, the way to make sure that, again, by eliminating these unnecessary parties who are part of the deal, you can support projects in the most efficient way for the taxpayer, for the state. To the extent that you still do have some tax credits out there that are being traded between private parties, we recommend that the transfer and sale prices be reported to the Division of Taxation and posted online, so there's at least some transparency around what the market price for the credits is. And then third, we do think that we should revisit this 5-year smoothing requirement, consider whether it makes sense to shorten it, to eliminate it. Also consider that if the goal, the primary goal of the 5-year smooth is to provide budget flexibility year to year, there may be other ways to do that. One way would be just through more conservative budgeting, assume that every year a large amount of the tax credit is going to be claimed. That way, if you're wrong, you're more likely to have a good surprise than a bad surprise. Or you may not want to go down the road of issuing a bond like was done back in 2008, but if there was a year where more in tax credits was claimed than was anticipated, the state could take out a short-term loan, a 2-year loan or a 3-year loan, to spread that expense over a short period of time, which would provide for some smoothing. There's no easy answers here because there are trade-offs on the 5-year smooth. There are pros and cons to having it, pros and cons to shortening it or eliminating it. But we do think that it's worth some consideration what actually makes sense. In conclusion, I do want to emphasize that when it comes to having a tax credit program that is efficient for the taxpayers, we've already come a long way. There are a whole lot of controls in place now that were not in place in the past. We now have 90% refundability for rebuild and for the jobs tax credit, 100% refundability in some cases for the historic tax credit. We have the test of need in order to be awarded tax credits under rebuild and the jobs program. So there are a number of improvements that have already been made, and I do think it is worth noting that. That being said, the 38 Studios tax credit deal, even though it didn't arrive at completion, has brought this issue to light and has brought us to a place where we are, I think, appropriately asking the question, can tax credits be administered in a way that is even more efficient for the state, for the taxpayer, that achieves the same policy goals of promoting construction, promoting economic development, but does it in a way that is cheaper and thriftier for the taxpayer? It's asked the question, do we need these brokers and private investors in order for a tax credit system to be successful? And the answer is no, you don't. There are ways to make tax credit systems, programs even more effective. We've presented with you tonight, we presented you with a number of options for how you could make our tax credit system more efficient. We've recommended our favorite options, which are full refundability, transparency, and revisiting the 5-year smooth. But there are other options like the online platform that you could explore. I think that there are absolutely ways that we can make the system more efficient, ways that we can make it better. One of the silver linings of this terrible 38 Studio situation is that it has given us an opportunity to examine these issues and discuss them. So I thank you, the committee, and especially the chair for your leadership on this, for giving us this opportunity, and happy to take any other questions that you may have.
Thank you. Vice Chair Chippendale.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer, and especially thank you for providing us with a presentation that is, quite frankly, probably one of the easiest to understand, especially dealing with such a complicated process. It means a lot for us as a committee to understand this. So thank you very much for doing that. I agree wholeheartedly that we have come a long way from a process that was just so available to all sorts of malfeasance. Just one particular question, and it's mostly born out of my curiosity, because bonds are pretty much in every discussion that seems to be going on today. In the 5-year smoothing that you spoke about, and I certainly understand how and why that needs to be done, is it always done through bonding?
No. So right now, there's no borrowing that's taking place. All that's happening now under rebuild and under the jobs tax credit is whoever holds the tax credit can't use it all in 1 year. They can only use it gradually over 5 years.
It forces that smooth, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so it provides the benefit of the budget predictability. But the downside is that, that loan that the developer took out from the bank to fund the project is now going to be longer and more expensive.
Sure, for them. And in the instance...
Well, for them, but the state is subsidizing that.
Yeah.
Right.
So in the instance where we did bond it, was it a revenue bond?
Oh, this was in 2008, and I don't believe it was a revenue bond, but that was before my time.
Just,
I don't know.
Again, curiosity, because we're dealing with it. I'm trying to educate myself as much as I can. All right. Again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the simplicity that you've given us this very complicated issue.
I think we have some more questions.
Yes, thank you very much. This was really helpful. What jumps out at me, and I go back to pages 2 and 3 where you outlined the tax credit programs, and that each of the 4, you told us who they were administered by. And so what jumps out at me is that there were such different terms for each one. I know it's before your time, but can you suggest why they'd be so different? And do you think it would be best if we went to one model, so that we didn't have all these different types, or is it industry dependent? What's your opinion on that?
Well, we are recommending, Treasury is recommending refundability for all of them. I think that if you decided to go in a different direction, like the online exchange, that could also be implemented for all of them. But there are some, idiosyncrasies. Obviously, producing a movie is very different from building a building. So I think, in the details of how you approve projects and how they're monitored and held accountable, there are going to be differences kind of in the administration from one program to another. But no, our recommendations that I've laid out here tonight could apply to all 4.
Questions? I just noticed, and I've been through the PowerPoint a couple times, but on page 17, where you're talking about the historic tax credits, and we have an estimated $140 million still outstanding. That's quite a significant amount that I'm sure does cause gray hair downstairs. They've already been issued. Is there anything that we can put into place? I mean, some of these could date back to 2001, so they could be technically almost 14, 15 years old, to put into place so we don't have this mass.
Well, the bond that was issued in 2008 should solve that problem. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? I want to thank you for volunteering to come here. We know it wasn't part of your department, and it took a lot of research, and it's really going to benefit where we move forward.
Well, thank you, Chair. And if you indulge me for just 1 second, I always make a point of thanking my staff. Those of us who are in elected office are in front of the cameras, but there's a lot of people behind the scenes, and in particular, our policy team, Kelly Rogers, Tom Seguros, Jeff Padua, B. Lanzi, Sharon Rose, David Ortiz were very helpful to me in putting this together. So thank you to everyone.
Great job to all of them. Thank you so much.
Right.
So next on our agenda, we have Paul Dion here, Dr. Dion. And he's here to give us the overview of the cost and benefit analysis of the tax credits. And that lends back to the 38 Studios question you asked, and seeing one of the questions that I asked at the time is, how do we know if the state's benefiting from this at all? Who's benefiting from it? We've seen right now that we had the Mike Corso being the middleman in this, and this is just taking it a little step further now. And these are just overall for us. Thank you, Doctor, for coming to present to us in a short time period. We appreciate
You're very welcome. I'm sure they changed them in finance, so I'm not sure how they work anymore. You're very welcome. Pleasure to be here, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. I'm going to take a slightly different tact than the Treasurer did. I will focus mostly on the motion picture production tax credits. I do have a lot of knowledge about historic tax credits, so I just want to make one point of clarification on the $140 million, because that number did come from me. Those would be, so prior to 2008, there was a certain number of projects that had to, when the law was changed, they had to essentially register, for lack of a better term, with the Division of Taxation and enter into these essentially tax credit contracts. So that $140 million includes projects from that time period. It doesn't mean that there's necessarily $140 million of credits out there. That's what they submitted. So if their costs come in less, right, the credit would be less. It's a better way to think about it is it's more like of a maximum exposure of credits that would still be possible to be redeemed against taxes.
So with that,
I'm sorry.
So if I could just ask a question on that, do you have any idea, and I know the Treasurer had said maybe having it more transparent, where you would know what things are selling for and who the buyers are, would that help then determine that maybe it's not the $140 million, that it could be lower?
So, I mean, that part of it is really a function of when the project, particularly is completed, what expenses are going to be counted as being eligible for the credit. Developers can sometimes want to have expenses eligible for the credit that we might not agree are really eligible for the credit. So taxation goes through that process and essentially reviews every one of these applications and disallows some expenses at times because they would not be, as far as they're concerned in their interpretation of the rules and regulations in the law, eligible for that. So I think there's a placeholder sort of at the maximum, and they can't go above that. So a developer might go higher than they really think they're going to be simply because they want to give themselves a cushion just in case. So it's not clear to me that I'd have to think more. I have to be honest with you, I haven't really thought about that much, but I'd have to think a little bit more about how a market might work to help establish a better idea of what the actual number of credits out there. This is going to be one of those things that after they've submitted and finally get the certificate issued, it might be less than what they originally put in for.
Right.
So I just want to clarify that the $140 million is essentially your potential maximum. But you are correct. Some projects are from way back in 04, 05, 06
Okay.
that are still floating around out there.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. So again, my tact is going to be slightly different than the Treasurer's. I'm going to focus really on the motion picture production tax credits. So let's just get this started. Just quickly, unfortunately, when I started in this job, I didn't need glasses to make these presentations, but that is that day has passed me by. So the information provided in the presentation, this is not going to have anything to do with how the credits are administered or anything like that. It's just data on credit usage and things like that. So secondly, I generally do not compare our credit to other states' credits. One exception, I will talk a little bit about Massachusetts credit in the future. But suffice it to say, there's approximately 40 states that have these credits. There used to be 48. Many of them have dropped off. Some states have suspended. They've reduced them. So there's a lot of variation now that's gone on, as well as some countries from around the world. Obviously, Canada, I believe, now has a credit as well. They used to just take advantage of the exchange rate. And I have to say this, in any presentation I make, the views expressed here do not necessarily represent the views of the administration or any other executive agency. Just quickly, I am the Chief of Revenue Analysis. I have a unique position in that I make recommendations to change our revenue system for the best interest of the state's economy as a whole. And at times, people don't like some of the responses I may make to some of the things they think are a good idea. So that's why I want to make that little caveat here that this would be the views, the extent they're expressed, which I tried to avoid in this case, really are of my office and not necessarily the governor's office or anyone else. I'm going to do a legislative history. I know the treasurer touched on this. This is a little more detailed than what the treasurer talked about. So the motion picture production tax credits were enacted into law in the 2005 session, and they replaced what was a film production tax credit, and that credit was not transferable. As a result, it was tended to be underutilized, although I will tell you that we had film productions occur in the state prior to the new credit as well. But it tended to be underutilized. The real objective of the motion picture production tax credit is to encourage the development in Rhode Island, of a strong capital base for motion picture, film, videotape, and television program productions in order to achieve a more independent, self-supporting industry. So that's the overriding objective. Then there's some intermediate goals and some long-term goals. Credits were transferable and we actually allowed against 4 taxes: corporate income tax, the financial institutions tax, the insurance gross premiums tax, and then, of course, the personal income tax. Unused credit amounts can be carried forward for 3 years. So you can't, if you have a $1,000 credit and your tax liability is $500, you can use the $500, but you will not be refunded the difference. You can just take that extra $500 and carry it to the next tax year. Proceeds from the transfer of the motion picture production tax credits are exempt from Rhode Island income tax. The treasurer alluded to this in his presentation. They are, however, subject to federal income taxes. Original motion picture production tax credit consisted of an investor tax credit and a motion picture production company tax credit. So they differentiated between someone who wanted to invest in a motion picture production versus the actual production company itself. The investor tax credit was dependent on how much you invested in the production. If you invested $300,000 but less than $5 million, you got a 15% credit of your actual investment. If you invested more than $5 million, you got a 25% credit. The motion picture production company tax credit was equal to 25% of your state certified production costs incurred within Rhode Island. And this is important, provided that primary locations were in Rhode Island and total production budget was at least $300,000. And obviously, feel free to interrupt at any time. Rhode Island Film and Television Office, I wrote established there. I should have said administered, but it's not clear in the statute to me, but I was corrected earlier today. But it was put in place to promote and encourage film and television productions within the state of Rhode Island. Certification and administration of the program is done by the Film and Television Office. Definition of primary locations. And the original definition of a primary location was a location within which at least 51% of the motion picture principal photography days were filmed. So if you had pre-production, you could do that outside of the state. You had post-production, you could do that outside of the state. But you had to have 51% of your film days had to be in the state. There's a very detailed definition of what a state certified production costs are that was added to the statute. And then multiple transfers of motion picture production tax credits were allowed to one or more recipients. And the investor tax credit was repealed.
I think we have a question. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Dion. So, I see we're going to move on to a more detailed section here. Just generally speaking, understanding that, the overarching goal is economic stimulation. We want, this is to sort of promote the film industry. We want people to come here. Has there been any sort of analysis performed where we've been able to look back and say, okay, here's a project that utilized these film credits, and compare it to what that stimulus was and what was the net result? Was it a beneficial result for the state of Rhode Island and our taxpayers, or was it something that ended up costing us money? Has anything been done like that? Or
so I'm going to move forward in the presentation and talk a little bit about that. Okay. There are some obligations my office has to execute an analysis similar to that.
Okay.
And we are working toward doing that. I've had a little staff turnover in the last 9 months that has kind of slowed things down. But
okay, thank you.
So in the 2008 session, the amount of motion picture production tax credits that could be issued in any tax year was capped at $15 million. Before that, it was unlimited. An impact analysis and periodic reporting section was added to the statute, and there's some detail there on what it required the Rhode Island Film and Television Office to prepare. The 2011 session, the impact analysis and periodic reporting section of the statute was modified to require the recipients of the credits to send data to the Division of Taxation directly. And it was detailed. It's individual level data on employees, et cetera, detailed data that is sent to the Division of Taxation. And Department of Revenue was required to prepare and publish the Unified Annual Economic Development Report, which includes the film credit as one of the credits to be looked at. And then in the 2012 session, the definition of primary locations was expanded to include not just photography days, spending at least 51% of the final production budget, including pre- and post-production costs in Rhode Island while employing at least 5 people in the state. And then documentaries that spend at least 51% of production costs in the state. Some documentaries obviously are filmed. For example, if you did a documentary on, the Sphinx, right? Obviously the filming is going to occur in Egypt, but the editing, the production, the preparation can occur in the state of Rhode Island and still be eligible for a motion picture production tax credit. Reduce the minimum total production budget necessary to get a credit to $100,000 from $300,000. And then it capped the per production credit at $5 million in general, with some discretion for feature-length films and television series. And then finally, it added a sunset clause such that no credits could be issued on or after July 1 of 2019, unless they were certified prior to that date. Finally, the musical and theatrical production tax credit was established. Its stated purpose was to create economic incentives for the purpose of stimulating the local economy and reducing unemployment in Rhode Island. So that's a little different than the film. The film was talking about using these credits to establish an industry here that would be able to move forward on a going forward basis. The administration of this tax credit was assigned to the Film and Television Office. That tax credit is equal to 25% of the total production and performance expenditures and transportation expenditures for an accredited theater production with expenditures of at least $100,000. And an accredited theater production is a for-profit live stage presentation that is either a pre- or post-Broadway production. So they have to go from Broadway to here or from here to Broadway to count as a accredited theatrical production, and it has to be done in a qualified production facility. Yes, Madam Chairwoman.
I remember questioning this when it was in our budget back in 2012 and wondering if we had just kind of tailored this to a certain entity within the state. And I know I'm putting you on the spot. You may not have the information, but have there been any entities within the state that have taken advantage of this?
Yes,
and
there have.
So,
my next bullet
perfect.
actually addresses that exact question,
Great.
which is that a qualified production facility is a facility located in Rhode Island that has at least one stage, a seating capacity of at least 1,500, and dressing rooms, storage areas, et cetera, amenable to theater productions. So that was the original in the 2012. Again, the musical and theatrical production tax credits could be used against all the same taxes as film credits could. The maximum amount per production was set at $5 million. And that's subject to the same $15 million cap. So the $15 million cap is global for both motion picture production tax credits and musical and theatrical production tax credits. But there's no sort of difference, no preference of one over the other. If you're going to go over, it would be up to the film office to determine who would receive the credits. There are, again, 3-year carry forward of unused credit amounts. And then, again, they can be assigned, sold, or transferred with the proceeds exempt from Rhode Island income tax.
So I guess if I could go back to the question with that 1,500 seating, has there been a theater that has applied, or more than one? I guess, are there more than one theater that has applied within the state specifically?
There has been a qualified production facility, which means they had 1,500 seats. There has been one that has held musical and theatrical productions that have qualified for that credit.
But only one.
At this point in time, yes.
That's what I thought back in 2012. Thank you.
In the 13th session, the Unified Economic Development Report was expanded to require a cost-benefit analysis to your question, Representative Chippendale, and that is something that we're going to be doing hopefully here in the not-too-distant future. That cost-benefit analysis had to include the cost of the state for the revenue reductions, cost to administer the credit, projected revenues gained from the credit, and other metrics that can be measured along with sort of a baseline assessment of what the original legislative intent was, and then that cost-benefit analysis was to cover a 5-year period. The 2014 session, the seating capacity for a qualified production facility under the musical and theatrical production tax credits was reduced to 1,000, which obviously would make other facilities qualified production facilities. So this is just a graph of, or a bar chart of the issuance of the motion picture production tax credits and the musical and theatrical production tax credits over the time period since the 2005 law. So you can see we started off, obviously the musical and theatrical don't exist until the 2012 period. So that's why you see zeros all the way across up until that point. But you can see in calendar year 05, it was 7.58 million of credits were issued. That jumped to 22.9 million, then fell to 10.9 million. The cap was put in place so it could never exceed the 15 million, and you see 12.8 million. And then in the downturn, in the recession, approximately 3 million, 2.8 million, et cetera, and then again a jump. So a lot of that volatility you see depends on a large production generally coming in to the state to do work. And then you see it tapered off again. I will tell you that in approximately, I think it's around 2006, Massachusetts passed a film production tax credit, and I am sure that had some impact on, combined with the cap, had some impact on productions in the state occurring. So you can see it was down for a few years, and now it's come back in calendar years 14 and 15. And I added some credits here. This doesn't quite tie to taxation's data. I based it on some testimony the film office provided at the November Revenue Estimating Conference and said, hey, these are the things we have in the pipeline that are being done. They just haven't applied for certification yet. So that's what the issuance looks like. The use, this is how the credits have been used over time. And just to follow up on a couple points the Treasurer made, this is a relatively short duration. Production lasts 6 months. So there's a very relatively short window. Time value of money, therefore, is significantly higher because you don't have to spread it out over a longer period of time. Basically, what we see happening is credits are used up pretty much by the second fiscal year after the calendar year production. I'll just walk you through a little. So if I did a production in calendar year 14, right, I got issued the credits. Keep in mind that if I'm issued the credits in the second half of the calendar year 14, I'm actually in fiscal year 15. There's a small amount of credits used in fiscal 15. There's a larger amount of credits used in fiscal 16. A lot of that has to do with the fact that high income taxpayers are on extension from April till October, and that October date, of course, falls in the next fiscal year. So it's a little bit of sliding that sort of goes on, but that generally when you get to that second fiscal year, if you will, pretty much 80% of the credits are pretty much already redeemed and used. So you can see we had a big surge in fiscal 08 of almost $23 million of credits coming through, and then 11 and 11, or 11 and then, yeah, it looks like 11 and 11. And then it's tapered off, obviously, because the productions have tapered off themselves. This is just a breakdown of how the credits are used by tax type. Early on, almost all of this was used against personal income tax. It has changed over time to where insurance gross premiums taxes are being used. It's being used more there. And I'll explain to you why that is. And a little bit with, you see financial institutions taxes, it's very sporadic. 1 year there might be a large number, and then years with nothing. That is used against financial institutions' taxes. The reason why the gross premiums tax has used more credits than it had in the past is because it literally is a gross premiums tax. So they're not, the personal income tax is essentially a net income tax, if you will. So a gross premiums tax, you pretty much know what your tax bill is going to look like once you know what your gross premiums are, and therefore they become pretty valuable to insurance companies, and they make purchases from either directly or from brokers to offset that tax liability. And then corporate income taxes are on occasion also, the credits are also used to offset some corporate income taxes as well. And I just tried to highlight the most, the biggest 2 percentages in each one. Personal income tax is still a pretty heavy user. Right now you'll see in fiscal 16 it's been the heaviest, but keep in mind the insurance companies don't owe us any money until March. So I anticipate seeing some credits go out in March from the insurance companies in particular. So the next piece, I do a forecast of both film credits and historic credits just to sort of give the executive branch some idea of what we think things might look like. Since there's a cap on the film credits, I just assume $15 million will be issued every year, even though that's not always the case. But I'd rather prepare for the worst and hope for the best type of thing. So you can see, even though this program would stop in fiscal 20, if there are $15 million of credits issued in 16 through 19, there will still be credits being redeemed out until 2023. So previous Rhode Island analyses of motion picture production tax credits. I need to flip ahead so that I can make sure I make a point I promised I'd make. So the first one that was done by my office, a long title, but essentially it looked at the macro impact of motion picture production tax credits. Basically, it was a static analysis. It did not explicitly account for multiplier effects. And it found that in 2005 and 2006, 7% of Rhode Island gross domestic product comes back to the state as general revenue. So for every dollar of gross state product, we get 7 cents come back to us as general revenue through personal income tax, corporate income tax, estate taxes, departmental receipts, lottery proceeds, et cetera, everything in general revenue. There were 12 productions in 05-06. They had final production costs of $120.4 million. That resulted in about $30.1 million in credits. That $120.4 million of economic activity that was leveraged by the credits yielded $8.4 million of general revenue to the state. Now, there are other tax sources not included in general revenue, for example, any local taxes. And then like motor fuel taxes, because they would be in a different fund. The conclusion of that particular study was that every dollar of tax revenue foregone, because we give up revenue when we issue the credits, yielded about 28 cents in general revenues back to the state. So there's a couple ways you can think about that. If you think of the dollar as a return, as an investment, then you would say it was a 28% return on your investment, or you could say we lost 72 cents on every dollar we spent on the credit. Depends on your perspective. That was followed by a study that the Rhode Island Film Collaborative sponsored. That was done by Dr. Mazzi down at the University of Rhode Island. His study used 46 film and television productions, so it went beyond the time period my office had used. So this is over the 05-09 period. And it said that $56.7 million of tax credits leveraged $276.8 million of direct spending, $188.7 million of indirect and induced spending, or basically every dollar of film credits leveraged $8.21 of gross state product or gross Rhode Island gross domestic product. Dr. Mazzi found that the credits created and supported 4,184 new FTE jobs, and I will point out that he did mention in his report plus 10,000 or more paid extras positions. I just focused on the FTEs. Generated $181.7 million in direct wages, $152.6 million in indirect and induced wages. So those would be the spending by the people who got paid by the film company, and then the spending by those people. So if I'm in the film, I go to a restaurant and I tip the waiter, that would be the income for the waiter is the indirect because the film paid me directly. The waiter then goes out and tips the next waiter down. That's the induced spending, just to see how the chain works. And $18.5 million in state and local tax revenues and $15.6 million in state and local, I apologize, tax revenues from industries that supported film and television. So weren't directly in the industry but supported it, say by caterers, for example. My office did a critique and assessment of Dr. Mazzei's study. We noted that even with the numbers Dr. Mazzei had quoted, the state still sacrificed $22.6 million of revenue because the tax revenues returned were not equal to the credit amounts that were put out. Dr. Mazzei had estimated that there were 2,599 FTE jobs created in Rhode Island's just in the motion picture industry alone. And when we looked at the BLS data on the quarterly census of employment and wages, they only reported 1,157, so there was a discrepancy there. Dr. Mazzei had said there were 181.7 million of direct wages, and that was 79.3 million more than the BLS data again indicated. And his 18.5 million in state and local tax revenues was actually more like 8.1 million when you use the BLS data. It sounds crazy, but Dr. Mazzei does still talk to me. Finally, the annual Unified Economic Development Report. We have produced reports for fiscal 2011 and fiscal 2012. We are working on 13, but 13 has an additional requirement that we need to satisfy before we can release it. In fiscal 2011 and 12, there was $13.8 million of motion picture production tax credits used, and 1,075 jobs were reported directly by those people who received the credit. Of those 1,075 jobs, 1,073 were temporary in that they lasted less than 1 year. Not surprising given the fact that a film production will generally wrap up in a 6-month period. The FY 2011 and 12 reports show that total payroll reported by these recipients was $17.4 million, or an average of $16,156 per job. Now, keep in mind that's an average. The dispersion is large. A star, for example, of a television series could have a wage in excess of $1 million. An extra could have a wage of, $500 because they were on an extra for 1 or 2 days or something to that effect. The FY 2011 and 12 reports showed that 21 employees of motion picture production tax credit recipients had received right share benefits at a cost of $83,971. And then of the 9 productions that received credits in 2011 and 12, 2 never reported the information that is required by state law. So they're not counted in those numbers.
But they didn't receive the tax credit.
Oh, they did.
They did. How does that change from what the treasurer said then, that tax credits aren't given until?
So they actually completed a production and received a credit, and then they're required by law to report to us literally at the individual level with Social Security numbers, the wages paid, benefits paid, et cetera. They just never filed a report with the Division of Taxation.
Okay.
There's no penalty for not doing that. So other than I just report, they didn't respond.
Could they come back again and try and get more tax credits doing another production?
So
or?
usually on the film side of it, it's a company that is set up once as a standalone, and then for the duration of the project, that company exists. When the project ends, the company's generally dissolved. So if I'm a director, for example, or a producer, I would produce a film under ABC, no reference to the network, ABC LLC, produce that project. When it was over, I'd dissolve ABC LLC. Then I'd come back and do MNO LLC for my next project, dissolve it, XYZ for my next project, dissolve it. So it's not as if in that situation that they are a long-standing entity. Right? They would generally be in place for as long as the project lasts. If you have a television series that lasts 12 years, then generally they would be in place for that whole time period.
So I know this doesn't have anything to do with 38 Studios, but just a question in general. So if they didn't provide that information to you and who was working for them in Social Security numbers, then is it possible they were paying under the table or giving jobs to people who shouldn't have had jobs, and then you don't collect the income tax or things from that?
I mean, I think anything is, I'll just tell you, anything's possible. To my knowledge, I've not seen that. Okay. But generally, if they were paying someone under the table, they probably wouldn't report necessarily to us the wage anyway, because they're already doing something they're not supposed to be doing.
Right, which they didn't, right? Because they just picked up and left town?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, that's possible. Most of if you think about the film side of it, there's a lot of SAG members out there, so they are making darn sure they're getting not only their pay, but their benefits as well. The only thing I could think of was potentially non-union extras.
Right.
Where we'll give you $100 if you just, stand there and, beat your head against the wall as somebody walks by you or whatever it is. That I could see, maybe theoretically that's possible. I've never heard that actually happens, but I guess theoretically it could happen.
All right, thank you. Or I guess, is there a reason why they wouldn't file that paperwork at the end?
It's a good question. Sometimes it involves, I think, the fact that the credits themselves, as they flow through to us, the production might have been in a prior year, and since it's been dissolved, I only report on the credits as they come through. So once the company's dissolved, there's no contact to go to. I can't tell you that's always the case, because we have had others who do report, or they'll say we didn't have anything in this year, even though credits were used. That production was completed in a prior year. They'll tell us that point blank.
That makes sense. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Mass Department of Revenue's analysis of their film credits. Let me just start off by saying there are a number of other studies out there that show higher rates of returns on film tax credits than this Mass analysis. I will tell you that in professional circles of economists, the Massachusetts analysis is considered to be the gold standard. But there are definitely studies out there that would show different results than this would. So let me just quickly talk a little bit about, there's a difference between Mass's credit and our credit. So first, Massachusetts does allow a sales tax exemption for film production expenditures. We do not. Massachusetts does not have what they call a qualified vendors clause. So they can purchase items from out-of-state companies and use in the film production and still allow that as part of their credit. Rhode Island does not. We have a qualified vendor clause, meaning you have to be a Rhode Island company in order to have that expense count against a credit. And then the production threshold in Rhode Island is lower than in Mass. So we're at $100,000. Take it back. Massachusetts production threshold is 50% lower than Rhode Island's. I apologize. So I think we're at 100,000. There's apparently must be 50,000. Why is that important? And you'll see in a few minutes. But it opens up advertisements much more than it would be here. So I'll show you some data on that in a second. And as I recall, the last I knew, although this may have changed, I believe Massachusetts is a 90% refundability clause on the credit, so you can turn it into the state and get 90% of the value. In spite of that, most of them still go through brokers. So the Massachusetts Department of Revenue has been issuing these reports since 2008. The reports provide an estimate of the economic impact of the film tax incentives in Massachusetts. They estimate the amount of new Massachusetts spending generated by the incentives and then the positive multiplier effects of that spending. They incorporate, and this is important, the Massachusetts balanced budget requirement. So they say, look, every dollar credit we hand out, we have to offset spending by $1 because that's coming out of the budget, and our Constitution requires a balanced budget, just like Rhode Island's does. So they take into account the state budget cuts that are needed to offset tax expenditures on the film tax incentives and the negative multiplier effects of such cuts. By the way, this would be true for any credit, right? Any credit that you issue, you would put in a balanced budget requirement. You would have to take spending down in order to accommodate the credit. So that by no means is unique to a film credit. The end result is basically what they call the net impact on the Massachusetts economy from film tax incentives. Their reports are long, 24 pages, very detailed, a lot of technical stuff. I'm going to spare you all of that. So I'm just going to look at the period of 2006 to 2012, so the whole period, not each year, but the period as a whole. Massachusetts averaged 116 productions per year during that period, comprised of 13 feature films. I'm sure many of you have seen them, including my personal favorite, Paul Blart Mall Cop. 58 commercials and advertisements, 26 television series, and 18 documentaries and other productions. Total expenditures on film productions are $1.65 billion over that time period, an average of $235.7 million a year, and 34% of this total is spent on Massachusetts residents and businesses. Remember, they don't have that qualified vendors clause, or $556.3 million. Total tax credits generated by a total of 812 productions over that period received film tax incentives of $411 million, or approximately $58.7 million per year on average. Massachusetts Department of Revenue estimates that $496.7 million of new Massachusetts film spending occurred as a result of these tax incentives. Now, Massachusetts does presume that some film activity would occur in the state regardless. This is probably particularly true for advertisements, ads that are being shot in the state, for example. Maybe not so much for a featured film, at least anymore. But again, prior to their credit, they did have feature films filmed in the state. So it's not like it didn't exist at all. The Massachusetts Department of Revenue estimates that the government spending has to be reduced by about $235.6 million to offset the cost of the state budget from the provision of film tax incentives. So the $411 million tax credit number I gave you, right, the fact that Massachusetts people get hired, $556.3 million, they spend money and, of course, send money, generate revenue. So they went carefully through and they net out the increased taxes they get from Massachusetts residents and non-residents to the extent that they generate revenue. The total net increase in spending in Massachusetts from the film tax incentives is estimated to be $261.1 million, or 30% of the total film production spending. So after all those calculations, this is what they consider to be the net new spending. Again, that's over the 2006-2012 period, not just for 1 year, but all years. The net new spending is then input into the REMI model, which I'm sure some of you are at least familiar from because it was used to talk about the Roadworks program. So REMI is a company based in Massachusetts that produces computable general equilibrium input-output models of state and regional economies. Massachusetts has a model for their state. We also have one in Rhode Island. So they use the Mass model, so the model is tied to the Massachusetts economy and the Massachusetts economic data. And they calculated that net new spending generates 5,532 additional jobs, 961.6 million of state gross domestic product, and $55 million of state tax revenues. Thus, the net cost of Massachusetts in tax revenues is $356.7 million. That's the 411 minus the 55.1. And each dollar of film tax incentives generates about 13 cents of new state tax revenues. So the earlier study I talked about, I had it at 28 cents. Theirs shows it at 13 cents. Pretty consistent, by the way, if you look at the individual years. So that is pretty much how the cost-benefit analysis would work. I'm using the film credits as an example, but it would work on any credit, provided you can get the data to look at. The last bit I wanted to talk about is because we do exempt from Rhode Island income tax the sale or transfer of film credits, musical and theatrical production credits, and historic structures tax credits. So we talked before about the developer selling the credit to a broker. The broker then sells it to a taxpayer. Those sales, whatever the proceeds are from those sales, they are exempt from Rhode Island personal income tax. Not federal, though, generally.
This doesn't exempt.
I don't, I meant to look that up, but I didn't have a chance to. I can't remember if they do or don't.
Okay.
I just wanted to focus on the Rhode Island piece because I know for sure that we do that. So again, we exempt the proceeds received from the sale or transfer of these credits. When the holder of one of the credits sells or transfers that tax credit for a fee, the fee received is recorded as income for federal income tax purposes. So it's in your federal AGI. We then allow the seller to deduct from federal AGI whatever amount you received from the sale of the credits prior to your determining your Rhode Island income tax liability. So again, this is for the tax year 2011-2013 period, so the last 3 years. We had 21 Rhode Island resident and non-resident taxpayers take a modification decreasing their federal AGI by the amount of the monies they received from the sale of a credit. The total amount of decreasing modifications is what we call them by all taxpayers was $416,043. Now that's again over a 3-year period or $19,812 per taxpayer. The personal income tax savings for Rhode Island resident taxpayers, because that's the only one I can calculate directly, I can't see through to the federal return of non-residents, was $5,318 or a reduction of 5.5% of their personal income tax owed. So that exemption provided $5,300 of tax benefit, which is about 5.5% of their total liability. Average federal AGI of Rhode Island resident taxpayers taking the modification was about $162,000, which is interesting. Obviously, someone who made $20,000 wasn't selling credits, but someone who made $10 million wasn't selling them either. So it's more of a range of what you would consider, to be upper income, but not necessarily wealthy. And no taxpayer reported federal AGI above $400,000.
Can I ask?
Sure.
We don't limit then the amount of credit. They could just claim it all, correct?
So in this case, it's a what we call a modification because you take federal AGI and we let you deduct certain things. So if I sold, for example, suppose I sold a credit and received $100,000, making that number up. That's not. I could then in my federal AGI again making a number up because I really wish it was $500,000, but it's not. Was $500,000. I could subtract that $100,000 proceeds from the sale of the credit. And now I have $400,000 on which I would then take my deduction, my standard deduction, for example, my personal independent exemptions, any other credits I may have coming to me, and then be taxed. So I would basically lowering the income on which I would be taxed by the amount of the sales proceeds.
And that could be, they could.
If you had $1 million of proceeds, you could absolutely lower your, you can't lower your AGI below zero. So,
but you could get to zero.
Right. But you could get it, theoretically, yes, you could get it to zero. Keeping in mind that on the federal side, you're paying on that amount.
Right.
So, we have a top rate of 5.99%. The Fed's, still last I knew, was still 39.6%. It's a big difference, right, in the impact. That's why the numbers seem kind of small. Mm-hmm. $5,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but, for an individual taxpayer, it could definitely make a significant difference. For argument's sake, if 100% of your income is selling tax credits, and you could essentially deduct all the proceeds from the sale and theoretically eliminate your income. I have no knowledge of anybody doing that. I'm just telling you theoretically that's possible. So that's the end of my presentation, and I apologize, I forgot my thank you slide. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have on either this or a little bit on historics, because you may still have some lingering questions there, and I might be able to answer them.
Is there anything that you could recommend to this committee as we move forward legislatively that could help your office or that we could do to make things tighter?
So,
and I know that's kind of.
I play softball, and that's a softball.
Yes,
staffing it's been a staffing challenge. The problem I run into, and it's not just me, I'm sure, but it's getting people up to speed. So when I hire someone, they generally don't know much about Rhode Island tax law, and that's, trust me, you're not going to learn that. And I can't just give you the book and say, "We'll see you in a week." It's time and experience. There's some tools that might be more beneficial to us. We have a REMI model that's an older version. There's a more contemporary version that allows you to model in much more detail the government sector, which would allow you to say, oh, we're not going to reduce spending across the board. We're going to reduce spending in, I don't know, please don't everybody yell at me, healthcare or, Medicaid or something like that. You could target things, or we're going to reduce it in business regulation or whatever. So that would be a helpful addition. But, I mean, the real challenge literally is there's a learning curve when you come into an employee in my office. When the people in my office left, one of the guys had 5 years experience. So he had learned, that time period quite a bit. Another person had a couple years, and then the other person had just under 2 years. So, when someone comes in, it's difficult. I'm not complaining about wage scale, so don't want anybody to misunderstand. It's difficult for somebody to get a lot of experience to come in at the wage scale that we start with. We have tried to make some adjustments to fix that, and we're going to look to try and bring in somebody more experienced. But, in the crazy world that it is, a lot of people want those people too. So most of the people who've left my office have gone to the private sector.
Any other questions?
I had a question, maybe you can't comment on this, I don't know, that the Film and Television Office had the capacity to do this kind of work? Or what role did you play over there with this stuff? What did they actually do over there?
So they certify the productions. So, I would defer to Stephen Feinberg, who is the director of that office. He can explain this far better than I can. But they get a lot of proposals in, and given the fact that they're limited in their credits, he makes some decisions about what he thinks a good project is going to be for the state. How he goes through that process of determining that, I just don't know. Most of the stuff the work that my office is doing is sort of on the, post hoc, after the fact, let's see how that worked out for us type of thing. So there's, some interaction between him and taxation on what's considered to be a cost that would be eligible. But other than that, I would have to defer to him to really explain how they go through that process of what's a good project.
Any other questions? I appreciate you coming. I know that it was a lot to put together, given that you do have a short staff, but we do appreciate the information that you've given us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
May I have before I do, just next week, as you're probably aware, we are going to have committee again next Thursday. And we will have Stephen Constantino come before us. And I'll go into more detail of how that meeting will run next week. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Seconded.
We're adjourned. Thank you.